So I would like to call this to order, and what's beautiful is the people sitting in the back dynamic does tend to replicate itself. Had I been thinking, and we will do it for next year. Where's Cheryl? Well, Cheryl Franchi's back there somewhere. She's the one who organized this. Let's offer a round of applause for all her hard work. So I'm not going to make everybody sitting back come forward at this point. Our guest, Professor Angela Harris, has taught for many years and is not unfamiliar with that phenomenon. And so we are thrilled to have her with us in what is a really signature community event. The Coen Lecture was established a really long time ago, and you can see in your programs a really long list of people who've come. And the idea is to bring an outstanding scholar from really international renown to Boulder. And this year is no exception. Angela Harris has several degrees, including a master's degree in social science, and she got her JD from Chicago, clerked on the Seventh Circuit there, and practiced law, and then started at Berkeley. And at Berkeley, she really was a pioneer. She still is a pioneer. Once you're a pioneer, you're always a pioneer. Among other things, she helped create the whole field of environmental justice. And that's something that we here at Colorado Law have thought a lot about in terms of our environmental brand. And it's something that we'll continue to be thinking about. For those who don't know, the newly named Getchus Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and Environment takes a broad look at the topic. We also have thought about this context through our focus on Native American issues, where environmental justice issues have long been a topic of concern. And we also have a very strong emphasis on critical theory. Part of how you came here was through Professor Aya Gruber, who this spring is putting together a tour de force colloquium on critical theory. And this happened through a fun way, which is when Kristen Carpenter, our associate dean who handles this matters, put out the call for colloquia, she came back with a list. And half the list were suggestions from Aya Gruber, to which I said, I think Aya needs to do her own colloquium series, and Angela was on the list. And then when we were looking for names of Coen lecturers, I said to Aya, who of course was the suggestion of all these great names, I said, well, who would you have as your first round pick? And she said, well, if Angela Harris would do it, that would be fabulous. So we were thrilled that you said yes, and the response here is overwhelming. I won't say too much, but to say it's really exciting how much the turnout has been, and I think it's a testament to you. We don't always get this level of excitement, and I think it's the pioneering work we've done, and that you will grace us here is a real pleasure. So without any further ado on my part, Professor Angela Harris.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And thanks for having me here today. I want to thank the organizers of the lecture for inviting me, and especially the awesome Aya Gruber for hosting me. And I'm sure part of the reason the turnout is so large today is not so much due to me as due to her amazing energy and persuasiveness in encouraging people to come. So thank you for that. I also want to thank the folks behind the scene who did the logistics for me to be here today. Those are the people usually not in the room because they're working, but I really appreciate it. And last but not least, I want to thank all of you for being in the room today as well. So we have just an hour, and I know I need to leave time for questions at the end, but I'm so excited about all of these ideas. I may start talking fast, just to warn you. I also have this PowerPoint presentation, which I hope you'll be able to see. I know sometimes, especially if you're backbenching, the slides can be a little bit fuzzy, but I'll read the important things to you. I thought it'd be good to have something engaging to look at rather than just having to stare at me for an hour. So the title of my talk is The Treadmill and the Contract, Race, Class, and the Environment in American Legal Theory. But before I explain the treadmill and the contract, I just want to show you a few images of places that you may not have heard of. This is Kivalina, Alaska. And just a little bit of background about it from a couple of different websites. The native village of Kivalina is an Inupiat community in northwestern Alaska on the coast of the Chukchi Sea. And because of climate change, Kivalina is facing increased Arctic temperatures, causing land-fast sea ice to form later in the fall and melt earlier in the spring, which allows storms to erode the land on which Kivalina rests. And the disruption of sea ice also affects traditional subsistence, hunting, and fishing because it becomes more and more dangerous to walk along the thin ice. By early 2010, hunters could not hunt seal at all on the thin ice, and whale hunting has also become exceptionally dangerous. In 2008, the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, which is an environmental justice organization based in California, along with the Native American Rights Fund and a number of private attorneys, filed the suit Kivalina versus ExxonMobil Corporation in federal district court in the Northern District of California on behalf of the village of Kivalina in the city against the United States' top 24 greenhouse gas emitters. And the suit, which was based on the common law theory of nuisance, asked for money damages from the energy industry for the destruction of Kivalina by flooding caused by climate change. Damage estimates made by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have been about between $95 million to $400 million. But of course, the social, cultural, emotional, and psychic damages are not really calculable at all. So these are Native people who are losing the link to their land and to their culture. Some indigenous scholars have described extreme cases of climate change producing such displacement as cultural genocide. The plaintiffs have also claimed that some of the defendants had engaged in a civil conspiracy to mislead the public about the causes and effects of global warming. And this was the same argument that won the battle against big tobacco. But Kivalina's suit was dismissed by the U.S. District Court in September of 2009 on the grounds that regulating greenhouse emissions was a political rather than legal issue and one that needed to be resolved by Congress and the administration rather than by the courts. An appeal in the Ninth Circuit was dismissed this past September 2012. This is another small place with some big things going on. This is far south of Kivalina, but also in the Pacific Ocean, the Marshall Islands. And again, just a little bit of background. The Republic of the Marshall Islands is an island nation located in the northern Pacific Ocean, part of the larger island group of Micronesia, with a population of about 70,000 people spread out over 34 low-lying coral atolls, comprising about 1,000 individual islands and islets. The Marshall Islands were handed from colonizer to colonizer, pretty much, beginning in the 16th century with its discovery by Spain. So it went to Spain, got sold to Germany, became part of German New Guinea, was occupied by Japan, finally consolidated into the United States governed trust territory of the Pacific Islands when the islands were conquered during World War II. Officially, the Republic gained full sovereignty in 1986 under a compact of free association with the United States. But politically, the Marshall Islands is still very much a colony of the United States. English is the official language. The country uses the US dollar as its currency. The US provides defense, access to social services. And the island basically has a service economy with a large part of its gross domestic product coming from the United States. And the Marshall Islands are overshadowed by the United States in another way as well. In 1956, the Atomic Energy Commission declared the Marshall Islands by far the most contaminated place in the world. So between 1948 and 1958, the US conducted 67 atmospheric nuclear tests above the Marshall Islands, including Bravo, the most powerful nuclear device ever detonated by the United States. Los Alamos scientists running the test made a calculation mistake and grossly underestimated the size of the explosion. They thought that it would yield the equivalent of 5 million tons of TNT, but in fact, Bravo yielded 15 megatons, making it more than 1,000 times bigger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. As a result of the Bravo blast alone, a radioactive cloud contaminated more than 7,000 square miles of the Pacific Ocean. Some of the inhabitants of the Marshall Islands had been evacuated from their homes before the test to avoid exposure to radioactive fallout, but others were not. And no cleanup of the radiation on a particular atoll, Rongelap, was ever conducted. 30 years later, 95% of the population of the Marshall Islands alive between 1948 and 1954 had contracted thyroid cancer, and a high proportion of their children suffered from genetic defects. Many women gave birth to so-called jellyfish babies, lacking bones and with translucent skin, who lived just for a few hours. In 1986, as I've mentioned, the U.S. and the Marshall Islands entered this Compact of Free Association. And under the compact, the U.S. set up a multi-million-dollar nuclear claims trust fund as a financial settlement for the damage to be distributed among the populations of those people most affected by the nuclear tests. The agreement also allocated millions of dollars to help establish a healthcare system and $3 million to pay for medical surveillance. There was also, at the same time, a nuclear claims tribunal established to represent the interests of those suffering personal injuries caused by the testing. The compact settled and terminated nuclear compensation lawsuits by Marshall Islanders against the U.S. government that were pending, while the nuclear claims tribunal adjudicated claims and granted awards from the claims fund. However, Congress failed to allocate enough funds to meet the claims verified by the Nuclear Claims Tribunal. So as of August 15, 2000, at least 712 of the awardees, which was 42% of them, had died without receiving their full award. In response, in September of 2000, the President of the Government of the Republic of the Marshall Islands presented a petition of changed circumstances to the U.S. Congress, requesting additional compensation to satisfy the claims based on new understandings of the biological effects of radiation. The request was rejected by Congress, and in 2006, a group of former inhabitants of Bikini Atoll brought a suit in the U.S. Court of Federal Claims seeking just compensation for deprivation of property rights under the Fifth Amendment. In August of 2008, the U.S. Court of Federal Claims dismissed the suit. In January 2009, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit affirmed that dismissal and concluded that, quote, "This court cannot hear, let alone remedy, a wrong that is not within its power to adjudicate. The sweeping language of the Section 177 agreement withdraws jurisdiction of the U.S. courts." These are some of the people who were there at the 2012 Nuclear Remembrance Day, a ceremony that goes on every year in the Marshall Islands. However, the U.S. Department of Energy did implement a series of strategic initiatives to address long-term radiological surveillance needs at the former U.S. test sites. The website notes the concentration of certain radioactive fallout in soils from the northern Marshall Islands is significantly elevated over that expected from global fallout and may enter the bodies of local residents through ingestion of locally grown foods. So this radiological laboratory has been established to keep track of what's happening to the bodies of the Marshall Islanders. So how do we think about these very different kinds of harm being done to people, not by individuals, not all at once, but by complex activities undertaken by private corporations and national governments over a long period of time in small places that we haven't heard of? In an important book published a few years ago, Rob Nixon names this kind of harm slow violence. He describes slow violence as calamities that are slow and long-lasting, calamities that patiently dispense their devastation while remaining outside our flickering attention spans. He includes within slow violence not only violence done to human bodies in the form of genetic and chemical damage, but also the cultural and social violence of community displacement, and the violence done to non-human animals and to entire ecosystems, which may build up and accelerate over time with still unforeseen consequences. this is what he writes, stories of toxic buildup, massing greenhouse gases, and accelerated species loss due to ravaged habitats are all cataclysmic, but they are scientifically convoluted cataclysms in which casualties are postponed, often for generations. Slow violence tends to be invisible partly because of its long time scale. It also tends to be invisible because its first and most acute victims tend to be disenfranchised populations. Nixon's book focuses on slow violence in the global South and the environmentalism of the poor outside the United States. But as Dana Scott has pointed out, the concept of slow violence also captures the harms occurring in places like Kivalina, Alaska, and the Marshall Islands, the South within the North, spaces under the political and legal shadow of the United States, although officially autonomous. And the phrase slow violence also captures harms done to populations unambiguously part of the United States, who are nevertheless made vulnerable to displacement, disease, and premature death through the slow violence of racial segregation and racialized environmental degradation. And here I just want to remind you of the geographer Ruthie Gilmore's definition of racism as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So slow violence is the first framing concept that I want to introduce to you. The second is the Anthropocene. So this is a figure published in an article, from an article published in 2001 by a number of scientists in the journal Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. And it's too small for you to see all the diagrams. But the purpose of the figure is to illustrate what the authors call the Great Acceleration, the imprint of human activity on the global environment in the period since 1945. So each of these curves that's sloping steeply upward begins the steep part of the curve around 1945. And these curves document a whole lot of different things. There's human population, total real GDP, foreign direct investment, damming of rivers, water use, fertilizer consumption, urban population, paper consumption, McDonald's restaurants, telephones worldwide, motor vehicles worldwide, international tourism. All of these sharp upward curves indicate that human activity is now at a scale large enough to affect planetary systems directly. There's now so many of us using so many resources that we're not only affecting plant and animal species around us, which is true of every living species, but we're now disrupting the large-scale and long-term cycles of biology, chemistry, and geology through which elements like carbon and nitrogen circulate between land, sea, and atmosphere. So the idea is that this marks a new epoch in geological time, the end of the Holocene, which began about 10,000 years ago, and the beginning of the Anthropocene. And this is some language taken from that same study, suggesting humankind has become a geological force in its own right. These developments are all connected, and there's a risk of an irreversible cascade of changes leading us into a new and profoundly different future. So climate change sounds like a technical and political problem to be solved, but the Anthropocene tells us that we have to go beyond problem solving and begin rethinking some of our basic assumptions about life on Earth. So what does the legal theory of the Anthropocene look like? My suggestion is that the environmental justice movement offers us the conceptual ground for an answer to that question. So environmental justice is based on the premise that equity, economics, and the environment are inextricably intertwined. More pointedly, environmental justice recognizes the role of power relations in affecting who lives and who dies, who flourishes and who perishes in an era of slow violence. For someone who spent most of her career doing critical race and feminist theory, the importance of power and subordination is not news. But using environmental justice as the legal theory framework appropriate to the Anthropocene does suggest at least two new turns for critical race feminism. And in this talk, I want to use the metaphor of the treadmill for one and the metaphor of the contract for the other. The idea of the treadmill is a call to bring our critical thinking to bear on systems of economic production, consumption, and exchange. and that is to address the C word, capitalism, and its relationship to environmental devastation and to racial and gender subordination. The metaphor of the contract is a way of calling to our attention the embeddedness of all social justice struggles in larger dynamics involving the human and non-human interactions that we call environmental, and conversely to recognize, as the EHA movement does, how environmental dynamics are always affected by human dynamics of privilege and subordination. So for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to say something very briefly about environmental justice and then briefly sketch what the idea of the treadmill and contract are as avenues for further research, theory, and advocacy. So this is where I may start talking very fast. But while we go there, because that gets a little abstract, keep in the back of your mind those small places and the faces of the people who live there, because that's what this is all about. So environmental justice insists that social justice and environmental protection are intimately intertwined. And it's also important to recognize that although one important engine of the environmental justice movement has been the civil rights movement, another has been the movement for indigenous human rights. So environmental justice is not rooted solely in an anti-discrimination paradigm. It also draws on ideals of liberation and sovereignty. And this is the preamble to the principles of environmental justice adopted by the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1992. And in this language, you can see how equity, both in terms of equality and sovereignty, is tied together with environmentalism and a critique of the dominant economic paradigm. As a philosophical matter, the central concerns of the environmental justice movement have been incorporated into the principle of just sustainability. And just sustainability is all about human flourishing. The idea is that human flourishing, the opportunity to fulfill basic capacities, depends on just social relations among persons, which includes distributive justice and procedural justice, but also sustainable relations among humans and the non-human world. And that's true in the dimension of space, if we think about the web of life, and it's true in the dimension of time, as we think about future generations. And the principles of just sustainability form the basis for analysis of the triangle of equity, economic development, and environmental protection. And sometimes these angles of the triangle generate conflicts, but the larger point of just sustainability as a philosophy is that in the Anthropocene, we no longer have the luxury of considering equity, environment, and economics to be separate and distinct silos. We can't grow away out of inequality. The carrying capacity of the earth places an absolute limit on capitalism's fantasy of infinite growth. And if we can't grow our way out of inequality, then redistribution has to be on the table. And from the perspective of equity, economics can no longer be somebody else's domain. So with that very brief introduction to the idea of just sustainability, I want to talk about the treadmill and the contract as metaphors that might help us understand what it might mean for critical race feminists to incorporate economics and environment into our frameworks. Start with the treadmill. So treadmill theory comes out of environmental sociology and the work of Alan Schneeberg, later expanded on by Kenneth Gould and David Pello, among others. And the idea was trying to explain why U.S. environmental degradation had increased so rapidly in the years following World War II. So back to the idea of that steep curve that we saw happening after 1945. And the original theory was focusing on the political economy of natural resource extraction. The idea of the treadmill of production in the extraction sector is that ecosystem elements like oil and gas are extracted from the environment with the help of both capital and labor. Some of the profits from the sale of petroleum products go into reinvestment into the production process. But producers are always looking to lower their costs and increase their yield. And one way of doing this is to look for technological advances that make it possible to replace human labor. So Schneeberg argues that producers' preference for capital investment over labor set the sector on this treadmill, where you look like you're moving ahead, but actually you're not. In order to stay competitive and keep profits rising, corporate managers had to keep increasing their level of production. Each higher level of production meant more technological innovation, more efficient production, and higher worker productivity. But each higher level of production also meant greater withdrawals from the ecosystem, both in the extraction of petroleum and in terms of the degradation involved in producing the new, more efficient technologies. And each higher level of production and productivity meant fewer jobs to go around and falling real wages for workers as capital replaced labor. And each higher level of production meant more waste ejected into the environment. Schneeberg also argued that the treadmill of production has political as well as economic and environmental effects. He suggested that economic success led producers to try to use their wealth to influence the regulatory environment, and that's the phenomenon that we in legal scholarship call regulatory capture. He also observed that under conventional economics, it's a good thing when producers do all these things, raise their profit margins, achieve greater productivity and efficiency, and externalize their costs. Corporations aren't being bad or evil in creating a treadmill. It's what the system is built to incentivize. So Schneeberg was focused on the resource extraction sector, but there's a similar treadmill that's evolved in agriculture. This is California's Central Valley. And the law school where I'm now teaching, UC Davis, is right on top, at the very top of the Central Valley. In the late 19th century, an industrial model for agriculture emerged in the Central Valley, which became a model for agriculture elsewhere in the US and around the world. So as in the resource extraction sector, the key to the emergence of a treadmill in the agriculture sector is resource-dependent technological innovation. In this case, a combination of seed technology, nitrogen-based fertilizers, which we know how dangerous they are, and pesticide and herbicide technology. So the idea of the treadmill in this sector is that leading farmers take up a new technology, looking for lower unit costs and higher yields. And as more and more farmers adopt the approved technology, total market supply increases, causing the price of the product to fall. Then comes the rapid spread of the new machinery, organization, insecticide, or plant variety, and the market heaves. Consumers find more food for a lower price, and producers watch their early gains disappear. Farmers who didn't buy into the new technology or couldn't afford to buy into it foreclose, unable to stay in business. And after the innovation becomes common practice, leading farmers again go looking for something new to increase output or lower unit costs. So this creates a treadmill in which, to protect themselves against rising costs and falling prices, growers had an incentive to spend more money on technology and to go big. So the basic elements of the agricultural treadmill, most of which had already emerged in California's Central Valley by the late 19th century, include monocrop farming, reliance on chemical fertilizers, reliance on chemical herbicides and pesticides, reliance on genetically engineered seeds, and reliance on capital investment rather than labor, meaning low-wage, transient farm worker labor. From an economic perspective, this model is incredibly successful. So California is an agricultural powerhouse for the nation, generating in 2008 $25.3 billion, over 70% of the state's entire agricultural revenue, keeping California as the top agricultural producer in the nation. But this economic model has significant negative environmental, economic, and social consequences. This is a quote from the legal scholar J.B. Rule, who says, "The plain truth is that farms pollute groundwater, surface water, air, and soils. They destroy open space and wildlife habitat. They erode soils and contribute to sedimentation of lakes and rivers. They deplete water resources, and they often simply smell bad." In terms of the environmental consequences of the agricultural treadmill, many of them fall on people living in the region. So here are a few factoids about the spread of arsenic, nitrate, pesticides, and other pollutants into local groundwater, which happens to be the primary source of drinking water for people in the valley. Air pollution is also a problem, so the San Joaquin Valley in the Central Valley violated the federal 8-hour smog standard on 455 days from 2006 to 2009, worse than Los Angeles. And during that same time, a very small farm worker community, the city of Arvin, violated the federal 8-hour smog standard of 370 days, making it one of the smoggiest cities in the nation. In fact, the American Lung Association ranks Kern, Tulare, and Fresno counties in the Central Valley as the 3rd, 4th, and 6th most ozone-polluted counties in the U.S. And Valley children have the highest childhood asthma rate in the state. 1 in 5 children in the Valley suffers from asthma. There are social consequences of the agricultural treadmill as well. A recent article in The Economist magazine called the Central Valley the Appalachia of the West. Valley residents have low per capita personal incomes, more residents living below the federal poverty level than California as a whole, high joblessness rates. And of course, Central Valley field workers get the brunt of some of this poverty. They make about $11,000 annually. And the need for abundant, cheap, and transient and mobile labor in the industrial or the agricultural treadmill encourages the use of undocumented labor and a racialized labor force. The history of Central Valley agriculture has everything to do with the history of race. We can start with the expropriation of the land itself from Native peoples who are deemed not to be doing anything economically productive with it, and continue with the long history of various racialized ethnic groups who were brought in to perform the farm work. As the historian Stephen Stoll shows in his wonderful book, The Fruits of Natural Advantage, with the exception of a period in which white Okies, environmental and economic migrants from the Deep South, became farm workers, the people at the very bottom of the labor chain have largely been ethnic minorities, racialized as socially inferior. Undocumented farm workers from Mexico and from Central America, racialized and politically and economically disempowered, became the mainstay of industrial agriculture. The steep gradients of economic inequality that the agricultural treadmill produces also have negative social consequences for the entire region. So in the 1940s, there was the Goldschmidt thesis was first published, finding that larger farm size produced a lower quality of life in rural towns by increasing the proportion of low-wage workers and moving capital and profits elsewhere. That thesis remains highly controversial within rural sociology, but at least some researchers, including Linda Lobau, have replicated his findings using current data. The Measure of America project, in its Portrait of California report released in 2011, placed the Central Valley at the bottom of its Human Development Index, concluding that if this area were a state, it would be in a tie with West Virginia for the worst social conditions. A few factoids here about the place of California's 20th Congressional District in the Human Development Index rankings. For all racial and ethnic groups, life expectancy is lower in the San Joaquin Valley than in any other area of the state. And this area also has the lowest high school completion rate of any region in the state. More than 1 in 4 adults never completed high school. Finally, as Schneeberg noted with respect to the political economy of resource extraction, the extreme gradients of wealth and poverty in the Central Valley also have political consequences. So decision-making bodies in the valley don't reflect the racial and economic demographics of the impacted communities. The valley serves as a dumping ground for the waste from other regions of California, as well as waste from other states. So two out of California's 3 toxic waste dumps are located in low-income, predominantly Latino farm worker communities in the San Joaquin Valley. And the Central Valley is not only a popular place to dump toxic waste, it's a popular place to build prisons. A majority of California correctional institutions are in the Central Valley, reflecting the political powerlessness of that area, as well as the larger social and economic processes that push disempowered and racialized populations to the margin of our society. So the treadmill provides one metaphor for drawing social justice advocates into a just sustainability analysis and understanding how the triangle of equity, environment, and economics plays out. What are some of the theoretical payoffs of this analysis, or this metaphor for critical race theorists in particular, as we think about the legal theory of the Anthropocene? It pushes us toward a deeper engagement with structural, racial, and ethnic subordination. So there's a current flurry right now of critical race work on implicit bias, which is really great and really useful work. But for many years now, there's not been as much work as there should be on structures of subordination, how life chances are influenced by the relationship of race, citizenship, and space. So questions like, how does the political economy of industrialized agriculture shape life chances by race, by ethnicity, by citizenship status? How does the physical geography and the cultural geography of the Central Valley shape health and life chances in these ways? Another benefit of turning to treadmill theory for critical race theorists is the possibility of better alliances between critical race theory and indigenous studies. So there's been a tricky, difficult relationship between critical race theory and indigenous studies for a long time, in part because of the way the legal aims of the two groups have been polarized. Indigenous peoples have been working for sovereignty and autonomy, and in that struggle, being identified as a racialized minority is a hindrance because of the Supreme Court's recent insistence that all racial categories are suspect. If we focus not on identity-based theories of discrimination, but on historically and geographically produced vulnerability to disease and premature death through an environmental justice lens, the possibility for political alliances and theoretical alliances between these groups becomes much clearer. And last but not least, treadmill analysis points us toward a historical and materialist critique of economic analysis and a critique of capitalism more generally. The logic of identity points critical race and feminist theorists toward thinking about class as just another identity category, along with race, gender, and sexuality. But the treadmill metaphor shows us a way to investigate how practices of production, consumption, exchange, and waste production are themselves entwined with racial meaning. This kind of analysis enables a much more radical analysis by bringing us face to face, among other things, with the ultimate horizon of mainstream economic theory. Once we understand that economies cannot possibly keep growing forever, and that we may have already crossed the threshold beyond which our resources are too depleted and our waste production too great to continue with business as usual, we have to think not just about class, but about rethinking capitalism itself. And we can't do that without a historical understanding of economics, which means including the role of colonialism, imperialism, and racialization in shaping economic circuits both around the world and within particular nations. We need an understanding of economic practices of production, exchange, and consumption as inextricable not only from social relations, but from environmental destruction of resources and the production of waste. We need a critical economics. The second metaphor that I think is helpful as we think about what environmental justice and just sustainability can bring to critical race and feminist theory is the metaphor of the contract. And here one place to start is with a series of books. So first came a book by the feminist social theorist Carol Pateman, The Sexual Contract. And she argues that the famous social contract that acts as a source of legitimation for the modern state in the thought of political theorists like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes comes along with a second contract that those theorists don't really talk about, which is the sexual contract that subordinates women to men. Then came a book by the philosopher Charles Mills, The Racial Contract, which riffs off of Pateman's earlier book. Mills argues that mainstream contract theory, like the work of John Rawls, ignores a silent racial contract, under which only white people were considered the parties to the social contract, creating political equality. Racialized peoples were considered incapable of self-government and therefore necessarily outside the social contract. Both Pateman and Mills argue that understanding political and obligation and the role of the state means taking these exclusions into account. Next, I draw on the work of feminist legal theorist Martha Feynman. Feynman argues that law needs a theory of vulnerability to supplement critical race theories focused on equality and liberty among persons. And here's one of the things that she says about what vulnerability means. The vulnerability of our embodied beings and the messy dependency that often comes in the wake of physical or physiological needs cannot be ignored throughout any individual life and must be central to theories about what constitutes a just and responsive state. The concept of vulnerability reflects the fact that we are all born, live, and die within a fragile materiality that renders all of us constantly susceptible to its destructive external forces and internal disintegration. We can expand Feynman's theory of vulnerability in the same way that Pateman and Mills expand the theory of the social contract. The first step is to expand Feynman's conception of the interdependent and vulnerable self to include not only the vulnerability that comes from our social independence, but also the vulnerability that comes from our biological interdependence of humans and the natural world. So Feynman argues that human beings, because all human beings are vulnerable, we have to think about a social self rather than the traditional liberal autonomous self. And scientists and environmental theorists argue similarly for a porous self that's not separate from the environment. So here's a comment by a theorist about the nature of the environment. The environment, as we now apprehend it, runs through us in endless waves. And if we were to watch ourselves via some ideal microscopic time-lapse video, we would see water, air, food, microbes, toxins entering our bodies as we shed, excrete, and exhale our processed materials back out. Another comment by a scientist talks about the way in which organisms are contiguous from the environment from the inside as well, whether through our digestive and respiratory tracts, our skin pores, or the cytoplasm of many types of cells. So as a human body, we are many different kinds of organisms. And she notes that a very different psychology of self and other would understand our beings as open to and connected with the environment around us through our external and internal services, as well as what we project of ourselves. Environmental legal theorist Marcia Stanton makes the point that all living organisms interact and depend on one another, not only in the human world or the living world, but in non-living systems as well. 4 natural spheres: the troposphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere. So drawing all of this, what this figure is trying to represent is the way in which we can nest all of the human social contracts within a larger natural contract that represents the interaction and interdependency between human systems and non-human systems. So in the littlest circle there is the social contract. We expand that with the sexual contract. We expand that with the racial contract. And then the largest circle is this transcorporeal, this natural contract. And the idea here is that if, as Martha Feynman argues, the state has a fundamental duty to respond to its citizens' socially produced vulnerabilities, then perhaps it also has a fundamental duty to acknowledge its citizens' naturally produced vulnerabilities. For example, to recognize sustainability as a fundamental value, not only by providing access to health care, but also by structuring family, market, and state activity around the recognition that life on Earth depends on the continuing stability of certain crucial non-human systems and human non-human interfaces and interactions. And from this perspective, slow violence, right, back to those places, those small people that we don't know about in places that are far away, those kinds of harms are an indication that the state is failing to fulfill both its duties to humans and the human non-human interfaces that sustain life on the planet. Right. An EJ perspective of overlapping contracts can also remind us of the paradox of vulnerability. On the one hand, as humans, we face a universal vulnerability through our interdependence and interbeing with non-human systems and entities. On the other hand, vulnerabilities are only partly constructed through this dimension of human, non-human interbeing. They're also constructed among humans through relations of power. We're all vulnerable, but some of us are more vulnerable than others. And the state has an obligation to address both sources of vulnerability. So, in terms of some of the payoffs of this contract metaphor for critical race feminists, thinking about the legal theory of the Anthropocene, the contract metaphor connects feminist critiques of the liberal subject with environmental thought in a way that avoids the essentializing equation of women with nature that ecofeminism frequently resorts to. It provides us with a means to start thinking not only about social welfare obligations, but environmental and sustainability obligations, essential to the idea of what government is for. One application might be in regulatory law with polluter pays regimes and the precautionary principle. But another application might be to embed sustainability norms not just into public law, but into private background rules of tort, property, and contract. Under this revised notion of the transcorporeal contract, in the era of the Anthropocene, governments might have an obligation to revise these background common law rules to make possible and support a steady state economics. And finally, the idea of these nested human and transhuman contracts opens up further paths for understanding the connection between the illusion of race and gender and the illusion of nature from the conventional social contract. The story of industrial agriculture in the Central Valley shows that the histories of capitalism and environmental degradation are not separate from histories of gender and race, but not enough work has been done to show how they're intertwined, how the stories that we tell ourselves about race, gender, nature, and development promote exploitation of human and non-human resources. So now I've talked at you for a really long time, and it's time to wrap it up. The era of the Anthropocene offers us, as a society, a choice. Down one path, we rely on ever more ambitious technological innovations like geoengineering, expansions of conventional economic analysis, such as the effort to further propertize and monetize natural capital, to keep on doing what we're doing. Down a different path, we rethink the basic obligations of the market and the state to follow an ethic of just sustainability. Either way, the era of the Anthropocene forces the silos to come down. We can no longer imagine issues of equity, the environment, and economics to be separate and distinct. So at most of the schools where I've taught, the social justice people are over here, the environmentalists are over there, and the business and economics folks are in a third place. Right? We're all in our separate silos. But we can't afford to maintain those separate silos anymore. We need to work together and to reimagine the rules together. We need a critical economics, historically and empirically informed economics, rather than the mathematical and theoretical economics we currently have. We need critical theory that takes into account the relationship between human and non-human systems. And we need to work with the environmental and climate justice movements, which are already trying to tear the silos down. All of us need to learn from the environmental justice movement and from theories of just sustainability how to see slow violence, how to think in 3 dimensions, and how to change the rule of law for a finite planet. Thanks.
We have 10 minutes for questions, and I'll do the Oprah thing. So raise your hand, and I'll come to you.
Hi. So when I asked my cousins who own a farm and work on a farm in Indiana how they justify using fertilizers and basically abiding by slow violence, when I asked them how they justify that, they respond to me by saying that they have a duty to the world to produce enough food. And it got me to think about a question that I rethought about when you presented this today. If we were to introduce sustainability into the law at the cost of not having enough, how do we justify that cost if we're in the world that has exponentially grown to have a higher population?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good question, because I think that is one of the strongest arguments in favor of industrial agriculture, the idea that that model is necessary to produce enough food for all of us on a planet where the population is growing. But I think it's a disputed empirical question whether that model is necessary. And I think we need to think about it very seriously and in an empirical way, rather than assume that this is the only way we can produce enough food. But look at ways of producing look at what kinds of food we're producing, how it's distributed, and whether there might be alternative models of producing enough food. And I don't mean to replicate a kind of anti-technological perspective on farming that we should all get our food from individual organic small farms. I think there's a role for mass agriculture, but we have to incorporate the costs of it, so we can't just put those aside and say, well, we got to do what we're doing because it's necessary. And we have to be really thoughtful and pour a lot of research and development into alternative ways that are not so costly to the earth and to social relations to produce enough food. And I think there's been too much focus on kind of business as usual, too much money pouring into the same old ways of doing it, and not enough money and research into alternatives.
More questions?
Hi, my name's Chris. My question concerns how do you cognize the cost of sustainability in an economic model that a business could understand? Period.
Well, there's already this idea floating through the business world of the triple bottom line, right? So there are these various attempts by business to capture the idea that profit shouldn't be the sole goal, that we also have to consider what's happening to the planet and what's happening to people. So people, profits, the planet, that's the triple bottom line. So one answer is that people who know a lot more about mathematics and economics than I do are already working on this and trying to develop ways to capture it. It's not easy, of course. If we look just at an example of Kivalina, as I pointed out, on the one hand, there are the financial costs of displacement of this group of people, but then there are all these other costs that really can't be captured by money in terms of the cultural losses and social losses of that community. So it's not that I think all costs can be fully monetized into an economic model. But I think it's important, A, to make the effort, and the field of ecological economics is trying in various ways to develop models by which we can capture and monetize and value, for example, the value of natural resources and non-human systems like air and water systems. So there are those efforts to capture what we can, and we also have to be humble and recognize that there are costs that we're not going to be able to monetize. And this is a policy problem that has existed forever, right? It goes back to the debate over cost-benefit analysis, right? Cost-benefit analysis is useful, gives us something concrete to think about, but it's never going to capture all of the costs and all of the benefits because they can't be fully captured. All we can do is do the best we can and recognize the limits of the models that we're using.
I think we have time for another question.
That was a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. So if I can shift your attention to the global scene, if you look at the other third of the world where the poorest of the poor are located, they are in sub-Saharan Africa, the least developed countries, some parts of Asia, swathes of India and China. But all of these people are geographically disadvantaged. What can you do about that?
Well, there's not a lot you can do about geographical disadvantage unless you're going to prepare to move populations, and those people living there might not want to be moved. But I do like the ideas that are floated on the international scene about convergence and contraction. And that is looking at the global inequality between the North and the South. Part of what needs to happen is a technological and financial transfer to the poorer countries in the South to allow them to economically develop in a way that's going to be more environmentally sustainable as well as less socially injurious. And so that requires some redistribution from the North to the South. At the same time, the idea of contraction is that all of us as a planet have to think about moving towards sustainability in the long run. So that means that, again, we have to consider both this universal goal of reaching a steady state economics, but at the same time not leave redistribution off the table, to recognize the inequity and the disadvantage between the North and the South, and to try to come up with ways to compensate for that.
For one more question, so who wants to ask the last question? Okay, Daryl. Of course it's Daryl.
All right, so just a quick question. How do you get people to move from out of their silos? Most people who are doing social work, because they don't really understand the economics and they're not that thrilled about the environment. Mm-hmm. People who are doing environmental work don't really understand social or the economics, and people who do economics generally aren't that thrilled about either two of the other silos. So, so how do you get people to want to move to the silos, and how do you get people to understand what's going on in each of the other ones?
That's a great question. I think it takes a trickle of pioneers who are willing to move into fields where they may not feel welcome, or they may not feel like this is entirely where I feel comfortable, but recognizing that it's important to think about. So being a social justice person and taking an economics class, knowing that, okay, this isn't the paradigm that I really feel comfortable with. The first step is educating yourself. And then the second step, I think there's room for a lot of pioneers when I talked about a critical economics. I think if you reframe the way that we teach economics to include history, to include the history of colonialism, imperialism, to talk about issues of race, I think a different group of people might be attracted to economic analysis and the discipline of economics. And then you create a bridge between those silos where people can say, oh, okay, actually, that does speak to me. I do see why this is important to know. So it takes those first few people to kind of go into a field that seems to evolve way on its own without any input, and to show why it actually is relevant. And that's part of what the environmental justice movement was originally doing. It was really talking back to those who wanted to paint environmentalism as just about, let's save the whales, let's save wilderness, but let's not think about people. The environmental justice movement, where people were saying, look, we are people of color, we are poor people, we are people affected by environmental toxins as well, and this movement is also about us. We have to take race into account, we have to take social justice into account. So they were the people who made that bridge. And so environmental justice provides a space in which people who are environmentalists first and foremost, and people who are social justice folks first and foremost, can find a way to talk to each other and find some common ground of alliance. Same thing needs to happen when we bring in economics as well.
Well, please join me in thanking